Our next speaker, Dr. Daniel Gascon, is an assistant professor in the sociology department at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and a research fellow at the Mauricio Gaston Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy, and the Labor Resource Center. Dr. Gascon's current research combines sociology, criminal justice, law, and history. He has published in scholarly journals such as Race and Justice, Social Justice, and Social Problems. Daniel is the lead author of the book, The Limits of Community Policing, and he's the lead author of the forthcoming book, Policing and State Crime in the Americas. He's also the founder and director of the Racial Justice Laboratory. And I will add that Dr. Gascon is pioneering some of the most interesting critical scholarship in this space on intersectionality and mass shootings, particularly how class, race, gender, and sexuality intersect to help explain mass shooting demographics and motivation. So yes, welcome, Dr. Gascon. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for this invitation and setting this up, and thank you all for being here. Wow, I didn't see this bigger crowd when I first started. What I wanted to talk about today is to share a little bit about my contributions to this book. One chapter that I look at focuses on one particular attack. I want to take a deep dive into that, but also talk about some ways that I want to extend beyond that chapter in my future work. So here is my basic breakdown. I want to, again, give you some details on this actual attack, and then I'll take you through the different parts of the project that I'm envisioning. So we're almost 10 years to the day from when, in the small town of Isla Vista, adjacent to the campus of University of California, Santa Barbara, an attacker, a 22-year-old biracial heterosexual male and unemployed college student, stabbed 3 young men and went on a shooting spree at several public areas in quick succession and used his BMW to run over several pedestrians between stops. After 2 separate gun battles with county sheriff's officers, bullets struck the attacker's hip. With the vehicle still in motion, the attacker shot himself in the head and crashed the BMW into a row of parked cars. He was dead at the scene. The attack in all resulted in 6 dead and 14 wounded. In much mass shooting literature focused on what's now recognized as the Incel Movement, many of them attribute that entire movement to Elliot Rodger, the attacker in this particular case. There is some disagreement about whether that is the case. No matter, what we've seen since that attack is that based on some measures, people claiming to be involved in or identify with the Incel Movement have claimed 90 lives around the world. Outside of criminology, much of the focus in the Incel Movement has been among political scientists and international relations scholars in Canada, the US, the UK, and Australia, and they are increasingly calling attention to the Incels as an international public safety threat, and are increasingly calling attention to the need to treat these groups as an international terrorist movement who are endorsing and engaging in extreme violence. So to talk about our uniqueness as a country, I wanted to shake that up a little bit at the very beginning, because I think the newest direction is really to talk about how we are now more connected because of the way that the movement has evolved. What we know based on their posting behavior is while much of the Incel Movement does not engage in violent behavior, their corner of what they call the manosphere, the collection of chat rooms and websites and forums that sort of enable connection and communication between the users, people who are interested in this kind of material. They're not exclusively of one particular group, right? This is a very diverse group. However, they still reproduce white supremacist tropes, right? They value white male superiority. They sort of value blonde women as the icon of beauty, and so they sort of reproduce these kinds of tropes that we see in other racist kinds of actions. In a very prominent work in this branch of the literature, sociologist Michael Kimmel argues that incel attackers are motivated by what he calls a sense of aggrieved entitlement, frustration for feeling that society is changing so rapidly around them that all of the things, all of the privileges that they feel that they're expected or owed to them are being denied because there are other advances for women in the workplace, for women in many domains of society, and similarly for immigrants and minorities in many domains of life. Right? The experience is almost like a threat to someone's manhood and racial expectations. But while there have been a lot of reflections on the growing incel movement, very few of them have been scholarly. Much of the attention on this movement in particular has come from journalistic accounts. I think a lot of it, again, is the attention that the media has been paying that Adam was talking about. Further, few of these works actually consider the larger structural factors related to the provocation of these kinds of violence, extreme violence, such as long history of patriarchy and misogyny in these parts of the globe, where we're seeing mass shootings of this type, motivated by these kinds of factors, and how they're related to the sense of strain that mass shooters are experiencing. There's also increasing evidence that mass shooters are motivated by, as we were talking about earlier with Eric and his work with his graduate assistant Katie, where a lot more work is being focused on intersecting strains, how anger and frustration start to accumulate based on different types of conflicts that someone has in their life. Some of the most recent work that looks at what I'm calling structural strain focuses on people's responses to masculinity challenges. When men who are most often involved in mass shooting attacks feel threatened, why is it that violence becomes the way to overcome it or exercise it or seek revenge for the kind of threat that someone perceives? When someone engages in a behavior that's sort of sanctioned, so when you engage as a male in violence, which is seen as expected, as a way to uphold someone's masculinity, that they're in some ways rewarded. But when they engage in those behaviors and they're not rewarded in the ways that they expect, it produces a sort of anxiety. So building on these kinds of previous studies, my work hopes to further expand the discussion around the need to understand motivations and structures of strain at these different levels, both at the race, class, but also at the gendered level. So the central questions that I want to know are which strains most motivated the Isla Vista attacker's behavior? How did the strains that he experienced intersect in the build-up to the final event? And how do these findings compare to what we know about motives for mass shootings since 1966? So this work will involve two studies. So the first part will involve a sort of qualitative approach. I undertook a case study in this approach, which involves looking, again, very deeply at a single phenomenon, a single case, to make sure to understand how a particular process unfolded. And in this case, I was looking at how the attacker characterized his own motivations throughout the whole process, right, to the lead up of the actual event. The data included his own manifesto, not only that, but police and legal reports that were collected not only during and after the attack, but also a number of newspaper articles that helped give further context on the shooting and his family circumstances. The approach that I took was this sort of two-stage coding process. I just open-coded everything, tried to get everything as best as I could out that was significant, theoretically or not, and then I tried to go back. I went back a second time for a more focused pass to try and find things that were directly related to race, class, and gender, and then expand outward. The second study involves a latent class analysis, where we draw from the Violence Project's mass shooting database, and we draw from a number of their different variables that line up as neatly as we could to the different strains that we articulated and found in the shooter's database, in the mass shooter's manifesto. And we also wanted to find out which combinations of strains were most prominent, which ones were most likely to be present or visible in the data based on, in the mass shooting data. We found that a two-class model was probably the best fit for the kind of data that we had in this case. I pulled a couple quotes from the shooter's manifesto because I feel like these are clear examples of the kind of pain and anguish and frustration he felt based on these different domains of his life. And gender and his frustrations with his sexuality, or really his inability to realize sexual relationships, was one of his most significant challenges, and it emerged in a number of different ways. You could see from this clip a reaction to a scene in which he saw another young man engaging in what he perceived as an overt sexual act, and how that pained him, right? There were numerous instances in which he made references like this, right? Where he put other young men in his circle, he put them against him as competitors, and he constantly measured himself against them, and he constantly saw himself as a rung below other men, right? And particularly this young man who at the time was even younger than he was. So these kinds of quotes throughout the manifesto signaled what I ended up thinking of as his subordinated sense of masculinity, right? And it related and it linked to the sort of strain that he felt that aligned with his gender and sexuality. It's very common for mass shooters and incels in particular to see themselves as these kind of wimpy, shy, geeky kids. A lot of them report being bullied for these kinds of things and feeling weak or small in their own bodies, right? Just feeling insecure about themselves physically. Whereas the expectation for manhood is supposed to be that we're all looking like Brad over there, even though Brad probably doesn't look like that anymore these days. By the time the attacker was as a young adult, he had become extremely frustrated anytime he was in the company of his sexual competitors. Not only like he talked about a moment ago with his friend Leo, but there were times when his friends were simply boasting about all of the sexual encounters they had, and it would send him into a rage. So again, he felt small and weak. You know, he recounted times in that manifesto where even being denied a ride at the carnival sort of was like fuel to the flame that he felt for his small body, right? It was all further motivation for him to feel so sullen. Though the attacker was often overcome with sexual urges, you know, he talked about being attracted to young women and masturbating and having sexual fantasies quite a bit. He never felt the confidence, the ability to actually materialize a relationship, right? Build relationships with women. So it was a huge source of frustration for him. I mentioned at the outset that Elliot Rodger was biracial. So that was a huge source of frustration for him throughout his life. Because his father was English and his mother was Asian, he expected for others to treat him as a white man. He saw himself as a white man. And he felt that he deserved the sort of privileges that white men deserve in white society. But because he presented as Asian, and because people in his circle, the community, treated him and saw him as an Asian person, it sort of created a sense of dissonance, right? So in this moment, when he is confronted with a mixed-race couple, a young blonde woman who he idealizes as the object of his affection, right? And this Asian boy who is a somewhat mirror reflection of who he is, and how he sees them together, it doesn't make sense for him. That sends him into a huge fit of rage. And it's one of the first times that he talks about being outwardly violent, where his fantasies become a reality, right? This is one of those moments, and it's actually one of the most pivotal because his actions, his behavior starts to sort of take a darker and more violent turn afterward. This is also one of the first times that he comes into contact with police. So what I read when I was when I was looking more closely at the different codes that race represented, I found that, again, he expected for others, for the community to see him as a white man, but it was never necessarily confirmed, right? It was always something that was in him that he felt that he deserved, but it wasn't something that was given to him by the rest of the community. And what Eric has said before is that when these kind of racialized privileges are not realized, it creates a huge sense of frustration among some men, right? And he talks about this most noticeably as he's sort of entering his sexual prime and entering college. That kind of strain and frustration really starts to come to a head at that moment. He talked a lot about his father's bloodline, about being British, and how that made it so that he had ownership over the bodies of white women, of blonde women, right? He talked a lot about that in his manifesto. And because he couldn't realize these fantasies, he often blamed other people. He blamed women for choosing poorly, for denying him when he felt that he was owed, and he also blamed other men, competitors, for taking when he felt he deserved. Right? So he felt that there was a lot of people who were slighting him. There was one instance in which he went to a restaurant with his father, and there was, again, a young blonde woman sitting with a young Mexican boy at the restaurant, and that was another instance in which he flew into a rage. He actually tried to throw a cup of coffee onto the couple before they left the restaurant. I mentioned that his gendered and sexual strains throughout the manifesto intersect with all of the other strains that he felt, right? And this is sort of the clearest indication. I put the class element, the class strain at the end because it really is really at the end of the manifesto, right before he commits his attack, that you start to see him fixated on class. It's really when all of his attempts to become gainfully employed fall apart. His family starts to remove their support from him, or start to threaten to take credit cards away from him, his car, right? But he's starting to see that his world, all of the privilege that he had lived, because his father was a Hollywood executive and his mother was in business, right? And he moved very freely in the halls of power in Hollywood and in Southern California. That realization that was about to end was almost too much, right? Coupled with the fact that he still had this urge, this desire to possess a woman's body, right? This was the point where he was really, his behavior and his violence really started to take a turn. So I characterize this as his inability to move upward, to be economically mobile. In many cases, mass shooters tend to be people who are in the middle class and then undergo or experience some sort of economic downturn because they either they're losing their jobs, either because of their own behavior or because there's a larger economic factor going on. But in any case, there is a sense of downward social mobility. But in this case, in Roger's case, you see it. It's not necessarily that he's having a downward economic experience. It's more that he's just unable to take off. He's unable to sort of see the kind of privilege that he has been expecting. I mentioned that his father was a Hollywood executive. He had this experience. He went to a Star Wars premiere, and he talked about how he really basked in that experience, how it was a moment when his wealth and his largesse as a man was like realized, right? He was so proud of that moment because he felt like it was the recognition that he deserved. But once he could not find gainful employment, and when he crashed out of UC Santa Barbara, when he crashed out of Santa Barbara Community College, and he was unable to find work that he felt suited him. I mean, he got jobs as a janitor. He worked construction. You know, these are very honorable jobs for a lot of people, but it wasn't enough for this guy. So he felt that these weren't enough, so his last resort was to win the lottery. Hopefully that would get him the riches and the women that he wanted, right? And he ended up driving to Arizona. He spent several thousands of dollars to buy lottery tickets, and when he did not win, he was absolutely devastated. He describes in the manifesto how he tore up his home. He went into several crying fits over several days because much of his life savings was spent doing this, right? Taking trips, trying to buy lottery tickets, and he crashed out. So what we wanted to do was to see how much these three strains aligned with the data, right? How well they're represented in mass shooters and what we know about their motivations as a larger class to be studied. So we tried to line up as best as we could, because it wasn't perfect, the different types of strains. So for gender and sexuality, for instance, we looked at relationship breakups. We looked at relationship issues, which was kind of a catch-all category. It included not only love relationships, romantic relationships, but also family, parents, siblings, things like that. Domestic spillage, which that dealt mostly with violence that started in the home, but then also could lead to violence with other people outside of the home. Instance which there are people, they actually stated that they were misogynistic, right? That they were anti-feminist, or that they hated women, and those kinds of statements. Also homophobic, if people were anti-gay, right? Any of those kinds of statements we included in the model. The racial strains were actually really difficult with this particular data set to classify. There were not that many cases in which race was the primary, significant, motivating factor for the killings. There were a handful, but it wasn't enough, and there weren't that many data points to really work with. So we didn't have that much information. And I think that's why the findings end up shaking out the way they do. In terms of class, we also, again, only had a couple of different variables to work with, and this is when we ended up pulling in employment changes or issues, problems at work, losing your job, things like that, but also economic hardships in a broad sense, right? Either debt or other sorts. We also included a couple of other strains that were sort of common in the literature: being bullied, having interpersonal conflicts, and having a prior criminal record. And so what we found is that in most cases, there were 1 to 3 strains present of those different kinds that I just mentioned. And it suggested that there were distinct combinations that we should look at, right? So when we actually did try and find ways to combine the different strains, we found that there were 2 classes that emerged, right? The first class is, it encapsulated 88%, and it meant that most of the mass shooters who had also intersecting strains in other domains were most likely to be motivated by or strained by employment changes. People who had lost their jobs, or they had been demoted, or they had seen significant reductions in their pay. But also how and whether that dovetailed with how much engagement they've had with law enforcement. The second class that emerged had mostly to do with gendered strains. Again, problems with relationships, having experience with domestic violence, not only, with violence in the home, but also spilling out into the neighborhood or in the community and other relationships beyond that, but also relationship troubles, including a breakup, right? These gendered strains tended to be the most common. These were the most common intersections that we saw. So what does this all mean? So the attacker felt that the strains about their own racial and class matters and expectations were very prominent throughout his life. But the one dominant stressor for him was definitely gendered and sexual strains. This definitely colored all the perceptions that he had in other areas of his life. And because he's the prototypical incel, it helps us. It gives us a sense of a grounded understanding of how to get at strains in these different ways, these different domains. It helps us also. It gives us a sort of conceptual understanding for how to define strains for mass shooters and for the incel population in particular. Unlike most mass shooters in the U.S., though, we see that the interrelationships between strains as they're experienced. We also see that most of the intersections sort of fall into 2 classes, right? Again, they're either employment and economic driven, or they're gender and relationship driven. And again, the latent class analysis offers some support for the ways that we've defined gendered and class strains and the dynamics between them, how they interacted. But I think we need to do a little bit more. I think we need to go back and reshaped the ways that we define some of the categories. In general, I feel like because incels are not yet very well understood as within criminological literature, I think even looking at these matters more closely helps us deepen our understanding of this very important and impactful group. So some of the things I was mentioning in terms of the limitations. Well, I feel like this data set didn't give us as much as we perhaps needed to understand this type of strain among mass shooters. I don't know what to do with that. I know the folks who have developed the database, they've done so much work already. I would hate to go to them and be like, can we just add a couple more columns? So I don't know necessarily what to do with that. I think with the cases that I will continue to examine going forward, I will try and pull some of that out, but I don't know how to address that with these data necessarily. I also don't think that we do a great job of understanding larger contexts. So, my wife is works in mental health, and that was one of her first questions when she was looking at this. What about questions of mental health, and how do we sort of address these issues? I think in order to do the kind of analysis I was trying to do here, we really couldn't deal with that very neatly. And there was also a couple of other contributing factors, like the degree of isolation someone had, which I think sort of comes out in the relationship in the relationship strains and that I showed you a moment ago. But also the sense of isolation and the suicidality. We're not really capturing a lot of that in the model. So I think we need to do a better job of thinking through how to fit those in. Nonetheless, I feel like this approach really allows us to sort of think through a typology of strains and how that comes across in different mass shooting events. I think going forward, there are a couple things I want to do. I'd like to look more closely at people who generally fit within the incel group, that type of shooter, those who are motivated specifically by misogynistic and gendered motives. I want to get a better sense for the shared characteristics among that group in particular using this model. I think we were a little bit too broad in addressing the data with this preliminary run. I think we also want to do a second phase of case studies, again, more closely on those incel shooters, maybe in this same way, but a more sort of globalistic approach when we go back. I think from the very beginning, so now, one of the things Eric mentioned is that I direct the Racial Justice Laboratory at UMass Boston. The bulk of my work at the moment is on policing and civil rights. Right, so my head right now is all in critical race theory. So when I go back to mass shooting literature, there are some things that really, really jump out at me as a critical race scholar that I don't think are very clear among other mass shooting researchers and criminologists. So a couple of things in particular. I was trained in critical sociology. One of the things that we looked at was labeling theory, right? It was very prominent in the 1960s. I think by now, it's still a very prominent theory, but because there's not a whole lot of quantitative statistical support for it, it sort of falls by the wayside. But I think in this case, to understand the ways that we as criminologists talk about and frame different kinds of shooters is important, because it shapes the ways that we make recommendations thereafter. One of the things I noticed is that when I looked at the recommendations for white male mass shooters is that there are some programs that come up consistently. Mental health interventions, short-term jail detentions, and a lot of social services. But when you look at the recommendations being made for young black men who are also involved in mass violence, but of a different type, right? We might think of it more commonly as like a drive-by shooting. The recommendations are somewhat different. The recommendations are more about punitive interventions, criminalization, long-term incarceration, and supervision and surveillance in the community, right? The violence is difficult and challenging and tragic no matter how it comes to pass. But how is it that recommendations are good for one group and not the other? I come from the school of thought that what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Why is it that the framing that we as criminologists are taking is racializing these groups in ways that reproduces other forms of racism. Right? We should be critically analyzing the ways that we put this knowledge out, the ways that we understand and interpret this violence and what then comes after. The last thing I'll say is I decided to take it out, but I want to address it now because this is something that we kind of talked about right before we started, is that this work is really difficult to do. One of the things that I don't think I really bargained for when I started to do mass shooting research is how much it would impact me emotionally, psychologically. I was reading a lot of this stuff in the midst of COVID by myself after having not seen anyone for sometimes weeks. And it was really hard to just be a person with reading all of this hatred. I would have to take emotional breaks for sometimes weeks before I could return to it. And in that intermittent moment, I would call my mom and sisters and tell them how much I love them. And it was just really difficult to get through this. So I don't know that that's something that we talk about, but maybe we ought to, as researchers, think about the ways that sort of trauma filters into us as we're doing the work, right? Even, maybe it's more harmful when we're looking at victims, right? Because we're thinking about how all of their opportunities, their possibilities were cut short, right? That is also challenging in its own way. So however we look at it, I think that's also something we ought to talk about, think about. Maybe that's something that I'll write about going forward. Once again, thank you very much for the great invitation and all the support I've gotten. And if you have any questions, please reach out.